A lot of people don't fully appreciate the significance of this yet, but China and the United States are currently at war. And I don't use that word flippantly. I don't use it as clickbait or to just be dramatic. I use that word war because that is the word that is being used by both the United States and China to describe what is currently going on in their relationship. Now, that war is currently a trade war, not a shooting war. But the word war is used specifically because that is exactly what it is. What is going on is not a trade dispute, it's not a mere trade disagreement, but it is actual economic warfare. The difference between warfare and a dispute is very important to know. In a dispute, two people are just angry at each other. In warfare, what you have is two sides who are now committed to forcing the other side to reach their position. Battle lines are drawn, and the two sides will actually now fight it out until one side or the other is forced to come closer to the other side's point of view. And historically, because this is the case, the psychology that leads to trade wars often quickly leads to actual shooting wars a lot faster than the contemporaries at the time ever anticipated. The reason for that is pretty simple. When it comes to trade wars, you quickly get locked into an escalation ladder that maxes itself out with no other actions that either side can take to hurt the other side more. That escalation ladder essentially gets maxed out when both sides simply stop trading with each other and each side begins to take a lot of economic damage. But once that point is reached, it can really only lead to one of three outcomes. The first outcome is that one side essentially gives up and lets the other side win the trade war. But that often does not happen because there is no real incentive for that side to give up. Usually, their economy has already been destroyed as much as it is going to be destroyed, and it is not really going to fix anything for them to give in to the other side. So they might as well continue with the trade war and continue hurting the other party as well. Because of that, trade wars often lead to the second option, which is essentially a stalemate, which is not good for either side because both sides are forced to take economic damage. And that will go on for some time until both sides sort of decide, hey, let's just give up and call this whole thing off, usually when there's new leadership, and that can take a long time. Or it can escalate to a different escalation ladder, an actual shooting war. One of the things that is really unfortunate about this is that the trade war is subject to the same loss of rationality that is present in actual wars. Namely, it is subject to the same human pride, both national pride and also the individual pride of the leaders involved, that causes people to stay locked in conflicts, perhaps a lot longer than they should, when realistically, it would be better for them to just give up. People have a really hard time admitting defeat when it comes to any kind of war, and that is why most wars will carry on until one side is forced into a position of defeat. Technically, this will be considered a negotiated peace, but the reason that people come to the negotiation table in the first place is because they feel that they have actually been defeated. And because the trade war is subject to that same level of pride and the same psychology that is involved in an actual war, the leap from a trade war to a shooting war in some ways can be seen as much smaller than the leap from the status quo to the trade war. The psychology of warfare is one of the most unfortunate psychological traits that we humans have. And it means that you're basically entering a state of mind where you don't care about harm coming to yourself if it means that you can potentially exact more harm on somebody else. And once you enter that state of mind, it is not a huge leap to move to other types of harm. The biggest problem with this is that because we are entering a state where we are allowing harm on ourselves, often we will take harm, and then we will get afflicted with a psychological desire for vengeance that is very hard to unlock ourselves from. Both sides in any conflict experience this same thing, where they blame the other side for things that have happened to them, regardless of who started the conflict. And again, because of this, the enemy needs to be defeated. And people will jump from one rung to the next rung to the next rung a lot quicker than you might think. This becomes even more possible with a trade war, because while we might look at a trade war as merely an economic war and not the worst kind of war that causes actual human harm, the reality is that a trade war often causes just as much human harm as a physical war, albeit in different categories. Particularly when we're talking about things like shipments of food and fuel and medicine, these things exert a real human toll if they stop arriving in the quantities that people are used to receiving them. People are dependent on the system and the way that it is, and that system often cannot be changed quickly, and so there is real problems created by the trade war. Those problems can be people going hungry, people unable to recover from a sickness that otherwise they would have had access to the medicine for, or people freezing to death or other things because they don't have access to energy. And all of those things create a real human cost that create real human anger and also a real human desire to do whatever is necessary to end that. And when the human mind is afflicted by a desire for vengeance, people's first step before acquiescing and giving up and giving in to the other side to end the conflict, the first step is always, I want to fight back. Now, up to this point, I've just described the psychology of the escalation ladder, but you might think that I haven't actually proved it and that this is just theoretical. So to move away from that, I now want to move to a section of this video where I'm going to share some historical examples where the escalation ladder that I just described actually did occur. I'll just use a couple examples, I won't use a ton, but the first is the Anglo-Dutch War that occurred in the 1600s. Now, like the United States and China today, at this time when this war occurred, the English and the Dutch were the two dominant trading powers on the globe. And because of that, there was a lot of animosity and a lot of jealousy between them. A lot of people on both sides accuse the other side of taking advantage of the other, when really what they were actually doing was just using their competitive advantages to the best of their ability. This led, though, to the English passing a new act to basically cut the Dutch out of the global shipping industry, or at least out of the national shipping industry around England. This was called the Navigation Acts of 1651, and basically what it said was all goods that were delivered to England needed to be delivered on English ships. Now, the Dutch, this really hurt them really badly because obviously they're so close to England. Their ability to deliver goods to the English and then kind of return to their home ports was a big part of what had led to their prosperity. And they had actually, to a large degree, built themselves around this. The Dutch had built very specialized types of ships that were optimized to have fewer crew and more cargo so that they could carry more loads. And they'd been doing this for a long time, so they had large economies of scale. So they were able to ship and deliver goods to England a lot cheaper than the English were. Now, because the Dutch had optimized their economy largely around taking advantage of this opportunity, when they got cut out of this trade, they took that very, very bad. They didn't just see it as an economic attack. They saw it as an attack against really their entire way of life. And so they began doing what any other nation would. They began building up their navy to defend their trade from the British. That led to a naval arms race with Britain as well. And within just a couple of years, these countries were at war, and there was massive warfare going on across the English Channel for shipping rights that up until that point had benefited people in both countries. Now, there's a couple things to analyze about this conflict that are especially important when we look at conflicts like this in the modern day. The reason for this conflict, the way it was presented to Parliament, British Parliament, was to protect British industry and British jobs from unfair Dutch competition, which wasn't actually unfair. It was just that the Dutch were better at optimizing their industry for this specific thing, which allowed them to provide a service at a lower cost that benefited the English people who had lower prices on their goods when they imported from the Dutch. The people who felt like this was unfair weren't the British people, but it was actually the elite class of ship owners, and particularly those who were represented with seats in British Parliament. So what you saw was the British engaging in economic warfare to defend Britain, but really it wasn't about defending Britain. It was about defending their own economic interests, and everybody else got hurt. The Dutch shipping industry got hurt. The British people got hurt. And then the war happened, and you can guess who fought the war. It wasn't the British elites who had caused the economic coercion. It was the peasants. Now, I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think the way I just described it, you can read between the lines, and you can draw a lot of parallels. So I'm not going to repeat everything I just said with specific parallels, other than to point out this important fact. Historically, in hindsight, when we see trade wars started, it is almost always, in fact, probably exclusively always, to benefit the elites within those countries and not the actual individual people within them. And the reason this happens is because for the elites who own production capabilities, for them it is always a negative to have global competition because it takes away their profits, and they have a ton of money, the things that they want to buy. They don't really care about the cost of goods. And for the people within a country, though, it's different. People within a country, they care about both having high wages, but also having access to affordable goods. And that is why free trade often structures itself in the way it does in the first place. For the average person, if you ask them, what is more important to you, having a lot of money when everything is really expensive, or having a modest income but everything is really cheap, for the average person, it really doesn't make any difference. And actually, for the average person, it probably benefits them more to have lower prices that originate from free trade, because that balances the system out the most to where people are getting rewarded for the actual value that they're bringing to society, to the entire world. And they're not being rewarded just for exercising control over a certain sector or a certain industry. And so you will often see things that are framed as a negative to the entire nation, when really, when you apply common sense and you actually look at the entire situation as a whole, you realize that the outcome of a trade war for the average person isn't going to benefit them all that much, but it does benefit the elites who often push for it. Today's episode was sponsored by Ground News. Now, if you're watching my content, you probably realize that the significance behind most news headlines is often very different than at first meets the eye. And the truth can sometimes be hard to find because in 2025, unfortunately, all media has a bias and every news source seems to have an angle that makes it difficult to just objectively understand the basic facts. One of the ways I like to solve for this problem is by using Ground News, which makes it easy to flip through various different news sources covering the same story, allowing you to spot potential bias coming from every side. On today's topic of tariffs and trade wars, there's obviously quite a lot of that bias. For example, when it comes to Trump recently being sued for his tariffs against China and other countries, we see the topic covered by the left as it is small businesses suing Trump, while on the right we see the same exact group of people categorized as either never Trumpers or libertarians. Obviously, framing matters. and often the framing of a headline changes your view of a subject before you even know any details. But ground news helps you see all sides of every story. Ground news also makes it easy to see who owns the news outlets that are framing things in a certain way, so you can follow the trail of money to see who's funding particular viewpoints. If you like my content, I think you'll also like Ground News, and you can check it out by going to ground.news/Paul. If you subscribe through my link, you can get 40% off the Vantage plan, which is what I use to get unlimited access. Now, back to the video. Now, there are, of course, a couple of other big historical examples of trade wars gone wrong, and I won't go into as much detail on these. But if you look at both world wars, well, a trade war was not the only reason the world wars happened. It was a big part of the escalation ladder that eventually led to the world war. And in fact, the trade war was often used as the justification by the truly evil people for doing the truly evil things while being able to point blame at somebody else. For example, if you look at World War I, it started the conditions that led up to it, to a large part, started as a trade conflict between Britain and Germany. And this trade conflict is what led both nations to build up their militaries. It is why they were so ready to inflict so much damage so quickly upon each other, so that when the spark came, the Archduke of Franz Ferdinand, that really set things off, the trade war created the conditions for the militarization that made that war so extremely brutal. And of course, what ultimately decided the end of that war was who could win as far as industry went. And so the trade war also decided the outcome of the actual war. When you look at World War II, you see something similar, with economic warfare, types of economic warfare being part of the spark for both the aggression of Germany and Japan. And the big reason that these countries were able to get their population to be willing to fight against the evil enemies, even though they committed so many atrocities themselves, was because of economic restrictions that then went up an escalation ladder. Now, in neither of these cases, by the way, am I trying to justify the actions of the bad guys here. I'm actually just trying to show how when the good guys take actions that are not perfect, because lo and behold, even the good guys often are not perfect. Those imperfect actions give truly evil leaders the justification to do truly evil things. And that is why you need to be so careful when it comes to something like a trade war, because somebody who is looking for a reason, looking for an excuse to go and do something, all they need is a somewhat legitimate reason to point to their people and say, look, we're being attacked by this person or that person, and things can quickly spiral out of control, particularly in countries that have 100% control of what their people see and think through control over the media. Again, countries like Germany, Japan, and now modern-day China. Now, with that in mind, a good way to determine what direction a trade war is going is to look at the propaganda of the countries involved in the trade war and look at what direction they are pushing their people. I'm not saying you have to agree with the propaganda. I am saying that if you look at the propaganda, you understand how the conflict, the trade war in this case, is being delivered into the minds of people who don't have access to alternative opinions, and so are almost certainly going to move in that direction. When we look at China right now, their propaganda is propaganda that is saying we are never going to back down in a trade war with the United States. The United States is the aggressor. The United States will blink first, and if they don't, we are willing to escalate this trade war as far as it can possibly go. And I have actually seen a Chinese spokesperson say, just today, I watched a video of a Chinese spokesperson say, we are willing to take all means necessary, including a trade war, an economic war, or any other kind of war. So they are not taking physical warfare off the table. And I know, I get it, they might just be bluff and bluster. They probably are at this point. But that is the direction that they are poking and prodding their people in response to the U.S. starting a trade war with them. And we see in real time how the escalation ladder is already moving up just within the first couple of days of the conflict. Now, I, of course, don't yet know what direction this trade war with China will ultimately go. But what I will say is one thing that really concerns me about this trade war with China is that there is not a clearly defined goal from the United States as to what they are actually trying to achieve, and there is not a clear-cut off-ramp to prevent further escalation. For example, the United States has a lot of legitimate grievances against China, and I could spend an hour listing them all out. Legitimate grievances from China stealing our intellectual property to China subsidizing their industries to make their goods cheaper and therefore more competitive against American manufacturers. There's a whole host of legitimate grievances, but the problem is that as the U.S. has engaged China in the trade war, they haven't listed a specific course of action that China can actually take to stop the trade war. They're just basically saying, you've been bad to us for a long time, so we're now going to be bad to you. Now, without a clearly defined objective, and with the escalation ladder already described as so fragile, it seems like it's going to be really hard for this thing to end calmly, especially when we see both sides, whenever the other side takes another action, they take the next action, and we're already now in this stage where both sides are acting out of vengeance towards each other because they both feel that they have been wronged. Right now, it is not moving in a good direction at all. And my opinion is that this thing needs to be de-escalated as quickly as possible, or that the United States needs to give some clearly defined objectives and action steps that China can actually take in order to heal the divide between the two nations. Because as long as those action steps aren't actually there and all we have is a list of grievances, China can't actually do anything to release the pressure. My concern is actually that that might be the goal. That the goal for the Trump administration is to start a permanent trade rupture between the United States and China, or at least a long-term icing over of the trade relationship, because in their view, that will support manufacturing back in the United States, and it will bring back more jobs and help our economy. Now, I've explained previously why I don't think that will actually work. There are a lot of factors behind why things are manufactured in one part of the world versus another, and tariffs cannot address all of those factors. But even if they do, the fact of the matter is that most manufacturing today is automated with very minimal human intervention, and that is especially going to be the case in a high-wage country like the United States, where that's the only way to produce goods at a cost that is low enough to actually be approachable by most people. So even if the plan is successful, it's not going to bring back a lot of economic prosperity to the average American. All it will do is benefit the people who own the factories, who own the manufacturing capabilities and are automating that by removing Chinese competition from them. For all these reasons and more, I don't think this is a good plan, but it doesn't really matter what I think. This is the plan that is being implemented. And what we see now is China and the United States already locked into an escalation ladder that is a trade war where they are each going to try to defeat the other. So the final thing then to discuss is which side is most likely to win in that trade war. Now, just on its surface, we should state the obvious and say that neither side would engage in the trade war if they didn't think they were capable of actually winning, just like in a real war. When you look at real wars, often people either acquiesce very quickly because they know they can't win, or they start fighting because they think they can win. Each side knows its advantages and its disadvantages. And in the case of the United States and China, it is not as clear-cut as a lot of people think. A lot of people in the United States are getting kind of pumping their chest kind of attitude, where we think that because we're the United States, because our economy is so massive, we will easily defeat China in a trade war. And to be sure, we have a lot of advantages and we have a very good shot of winning. But the fact of the matter is that China has a lot of advantages too. China, for one, is not a democracy. So their leaders don't really care what their people think or how much the individual people within the country suffer. They just care about actually achieving their objectives. That is not something that the president has the luxury of, because the president is only in office for a couple of years. And actually, within a year and a half, we're going to be having midterms, and that could be a massive change there as well. So just on its surface, China has the ability to pick a strategy and stick to it while taking a lot more pain than the US can. China also has been preparing for this, and that is obvious because China has been stockpiling commodities and already trying to move their exports away from the United States, because since Trump has been running, he has been talking about doing this, and so China has had a whole lot of time to prepare. On the other hand, Americans, as far as I know, I don't know anybody who's been stockpiling Chinese goods. In fact, as these trade wars have started, we've seen a lot of people in the United States going out and kind of trying to panic buy anything they can, especially expensive things, so that they can have everything they need to last them through the trade war. Also, because of the way the objectives are set up, the way that the United States is approaching this, because we don't have a clear path to victory, it makes it difficult for us to actually win because we haven't defined what victory looks like. Where for China, victory probably is as simple as, let's just hold on for 3 or 4 years until Trump is out of office and a different president comes that we can negotiate with differently. And so just right there, we see, even though the US is dominant, China has a lot of advantages that they're not being given proper credit for. We are very quickly underestimating our enemy, and that's what you never want to do. When you look at the Russia and Ukraine war, you see a similar situation where Russia, this massive country compared to Ukraine, just dwarfs Ukraine in size, dwarfs Ukraine in economy, is being held back by Ukraine relatively easily, if we're being honest, compared to the quick collapse that most people expected. So I think the United States can win, but it's unfortunately not a 100% chance. It's not a clear-cut path to victory, and that means that this could get a whole lot uglier before it gets any better. In either case, whatever happens, we are certainly living through a unique period of history. Let's just say it like that. And Lord willing, I hope to continue to be here to analyze everything that's going on and hopefully bring a lot more clarity to all of you guys. And you guys can also bring more clarity to me by leaving comments about things that I've missed. That in mind, before you go, if you want to support the channel, you can do so in a couple of ways. You can do so via Patreon or buy me a coffee. There's QR codes on screen and links in the description of the video. Thanks so much for those of you who choose to support the channel. It really does make a difference in the amount of videos I'm able to publish and the quality of the research that I'm able to do for all of you guys. So thanks again. I'll see you on the next video.